a lot of good things and really good things, but as you saw in the bio that we sent around, Jonathan has been, his most recent venture has been running the MacArthur Foundation for 10 years and doing a fabulous job, and before that for 17. New school in New York, which again needed a serious turnaround, and Jonathan really did it. And so I won't go back any further. Joel could, but because you know each other from long.
How far back would you like to go?
The 20s? No, can't be done.
No, we may look that old.
And so Jonathan has some lessons he learned and some thoughts about where this, what might have been done better, but I'm going to let you do it in your own words. We usually begin by going around the table so you know, have a sense of who the people are and where they're from. So if it's okay with you, we'll start with the young man to my left, who will introduce himself, and then we'll go around, who are you and where you, what's your connection to do, or not to do.
Or what's your connection?
You are Duke.
I'm Joel Fleischman, and I teach here in the Sanford School of Public Policy. And I'm a colleague of Ed Slute's.
I'm Tom Lambeth, and I'm a senior fellow at the Z. Smith Rumpus Foundation in Winston-Salem.
J.T. Vaughn, I worked with Cherokee in Ethiopia for about 2 years and was introduced to Dr. Fleischman. He invited.
I'm Catherine Burnett. I'm Program Officer with the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust in Chapel Hill.
I'm Patrick Sable. I'm a first-year public policy student here at Sanford, and I'm also Professor Fleischman's teaching assistant.
And research assistant, too.
Yes, on the side.
I'm Martin Eakes. I work with Self-Help Credit Union and the Center for Responsible Lending based in Durham.
And a MacArthur grantee, and
Genius,
make a list of all the grants we've made and the people we've made geniuses, or recognize their genius, Martin, would be really near the top.
What you're saying is I am indebted to the MacArthur Foundation for life.
We need we need
I'm Ariel Hayes. I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student.
Sandra Jacoby. John and I grew up in the same hometown, and I do documentary video work here in Durham.
I'm Bruce Payne. I'm the executive director of the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation, and I'm a recovering academic.
I'm Sarah Burdick with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society.
I'm Justin Blake. I'm at Duke for the month doing a media fellowship here at Sanford, and normally I work at Edelman, a PR agency in New York, where I run the Corporate and Public Affairs Division, which includes our corporate social responsibility work.
Peter Garrett. I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student in Slute's class.
I'm Linda Payne Edwards, a public policy student.
I'm Anne Marie Eisen. I'm a clinical psychologist and a research scientist at the Center for Child Policy.
I am Jess Taylor, and I'm with the Triangle Community Foundation.
I'm Kate Stratton, a senior fellow at NBC.
Megan Golden. I'm a student at the business school and also in Professor Fleischman's class this term. I'm Nancy Lowe, director of the Duke Nonprofit Management Program.
Eric Varela. I work with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy.
Katie Harold, a PhD student here at Sanford.
I'm Nancy Bernstein, senior manager for international strategy.
Oh, Rand.
I'm Rand Coble. Apologize for being a little late. I work with the Center for Public Policy Research in Raleigh, and I'm one of Bruce Payne's students, who is one of the best teacher I ever had.
Work for is an understatement. He founded the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research and been running it ever since.
I'm Francis Lester. I'm the director of the Duke Center for International Development, and I was the advisor of your former assistant, Sean Thierry.
He's terrific.
Charles Potfelder. I'm on the faculty in the Sanford School.
There you go. Okay. Well, it's good to be back at Duke, especially now that my good friend Ed Slute is director of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. I realize that is my full name, but
That's close. That's 2/3 of the name.
Ed is one of the best foundation leaders of his generation, and I think is a model of how a modest but sharply focused foundation with a real strategy can make a difference. And Joel has been my mentor for 40 years, the person I trust most in philanthropy, and really the person who introduced me to the world of large foundations. I recall back in the 60s, on occasion, editing proposals and reports to the likes of Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, only names for me, but no question that he started me on my road that led to MacArthur.
You did a very good job with those proposals, too.
Well, let's put it this way: the prose was ample. My job was to pick the best words and put them together. And the guest you had last week, some of you I know were there, Elizabeth McCormick, accelerated my path to MacArthur since she was on the search committee and a long time friend, and also a person for whom I have great respect. Pat makes me a little nervous by telling me that Elizabeth was the most spectacular speaker ever.
Oh, no.
Her usual irreverent and candid and passionate self. So this would be a little bit of a counterbalance to Elizabeth, I fear.
Not that you're going to be reverent.
In any case, I'm back at Duke, not just because I always say yes to Joel and Ed, but because I really enjoyed my last visit here in 2007. At this seminar, I spoke about how foundations use their reputational assets to good effect, and how reputational assets can, in some cases, be as important as the money. And then I did have an opportunity to speak to Joel's class on the role of foundations in, shall we say, influencing public policy. And as I look back on my last visit, 2007, it was the kind of high point of my 10-year run at MacArthur. And endowments were rising, more money to spend, initiatives like the digital media and learning just ready to be launched, strong staff in place, a board that had been reshaped, and beyond the program, I do think the foundation's reputation was never higher. But now I come almost a year out of office, and I really welcome the opportunity for the first time to reflect on some lessons learned. So I'm going to offer some comments, maybe 20 minutes worth, and then, as we did a couple years ago, I hope have a really good discussion where MacArthur, but philanthropy more broadly, is on the table, and no questions impolite. Just say what you think and ask what you think, and I'd be happy to respond. I have been staying away from all speaking engagements during my transitional sabbatical, so this is the first time that I've been at a session and given a talk on philanthropy since leaving MacArthur, so this is the beginning of a new era, returning back to the arena. First, a quick reminder of MacArthur's profile. It began grant making in '78 when Mr. MacArthur died. He made his money in insurance and real estate, and his will gave the trustees no advice about how to spend the money, so there is no donor intent. Over the years, the foundation grew to be one of the 10 largest U.S. foundations, working in 60 countries. In my last year, we gave out about $250 million in grants and another, say, $25 million or so in program-related investments. Almost everybody knows about the Genius Awards, but that's only 5% of where the money goes. In the U.S., MacArthur works on, I'll still say we, works on affordable rental housing preservation, community development, basically urban renewal, juvenile justice reform, education, principally how new technologies are changing the way young people are learning. The international program includes population and reproductive health, human rights, and international justice, a particular interest of mine. I have been chairman of Human Rights Watch for a long time. International peace and security, principally reducing dangers from weapons of mass destruction. And so we saw a lot of our groundwork come to some fruition earlier this week. I'm very pleased to see progress is taking shape. And finally, conservation, principally biodiversity preservation. We also have a general program, which I like because it is a place where out-of-program ideas can go and at least receive a sympathetic hearing. And in the general program also our work on public television and radio and independent documentaries is housed there. So that's basically what it looks like. I came away from 10 years and I had a 10-year term. I believe in terms. Everybody, trustees, program officers, president, all have terms. I came away feeling pretty good about what has been accomplished. So I want to share with you some of the insights. Nothing profound, probably nothing you would have thought about, but it was helpful to me to go back and say, well, what did I learn along the way? And then I might offer some things I might have done differently. Bottom line, I think, is that effective philanthropy is a lot harder than it looks. Having been turned down, as I'm sure many of you have, by foundations, not always courteously, I came in with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, perhaps, certainly skepticism, healthy skepticism, I would say, about the profession of philanthropy. And I emerged on the other end with a much greater respect for what is science, but also an art as well. And as I say, not as easy as it looks. You don't do any harm, but the responsibility of doing as much good as you can in a way that sustains itself is a weighty responsibility, and it turns out to be a real challenge. So let me offer a few points. The first I've already made, and I won't repeat because it was a topic last time, and that is that reputation really does matter. So being transparent, being open, and open to other people's ideas, and not being ideological, all those contribute. Also treating people decently, answering phone calls, letters, emails, explaining why you do things or don't do things is very, very important. So reputation, and when you build that reputation, then it can be as important as the money. And oftentimes a group would come to us and say, no, this is out of program, but if MacArthur would give $50,000 or $100,000, it would make a big difference in establishing credibility for our fledgling organization or the issue we care about. So protecting that reputation, and in my case, really pulling it back from a kind of reflexive left, not to the center, but to a reputation that was open and principled, not come back in the end to some core values that I think we stood for, was a big part of what I tried to do, and I think I accomplished. Second point is that focus is critical. No new news here, but when I started, MacArthur had 70 elements of work. The masthead litany I just gave you was something like 8 or 9 pieces of work, but underneath, there's much more. And so my first year was spent really trying to understand the full reach of MacArthur, and it was massive. And that was okay. I don't criticize my predecessor. She did a great job, but MacArthur was then in a kind of adolescent stage, trying out a lot of new things. It was my job to bring it into early adulthood and to make some choices. And so over the years, I really cut the number of program elements, and an element might be conservation in Latin America or human rights in Nigeria. I cut the number of elements in half and raised the average grant size adjusted for inflation by 135%. And set some clear goals in each area. We had to specify how many hectares we were trying to save of rainforest in Peru, or wanted to cut the maternal mortality rate in poor areas of Mexico by half, or reducing racial disparities in the U.S. juvenile justice system by, say, 20% over a 5 or 10 year period. So focus and clarity of strategy and goals would be the second point. Third is innovation and creativity. Not everything can be measured. And I believe foundations should set aside a portion of their giving as risk capital. I'm a big one for measurement. All the staff will tell you I drove them crazy, but I also believe that it's a mistake to give away your freedom, if you have it, to take risks and innovate. And one of the best things I think I did was to start late in my tenure an idea which we call simply the New Ideas process, and I wrote 100 people every year, and I said, tell us something we don't know. Tell us a problem nobody else has spotted or defined properly or is working on, or a solution, intervention that you think needs to be tested. And some really interesting work came out of this process. We started a whole new field called law and neuroscience that's just taking shape. We invested in a group led by Jeff Sachs to start a really new way of training development professionals, people working in the developing world, that will have the effect on the preparation of development professionals, I think, comparable to what the Flexner report had in changing the way we train medical professionals. I think we're early in understanding the country was on an unsustainable course with its fiscal policies, and we therefore got the national academies to put together a blue-ribbon nonpartisan committee to lay out really how bad it is, and also to offer 5 scenarios which were based on values and preferences about how you would address the problem. Well, that issue now is front and center, and the work we did, including the work we did in reprojecting longevity, which turns out, happily, in a way, to be longer than anybody supposed, but also big impact on predictions for Social Security, Medicare, and all the rest. Anyway, that work was done just at the right time, and we caught the cycle, and it's now, I think, really grounding the conversation in good objective data. So, bottom line is that one ought to look at the grant budget, I think, as a portfolio, just as you would not put Duke's endowment all in one class of assets, nor, in my view, should you put your philanthropic dollar into one style of philanthropy or one type of philanthropy. Have it be a mix of things you could measure and do something about, some things that are looking over the horizon and that are risky. Fourth point, institutions matter. Foundations do very little directly. We depend on others to turn our dreams into reality, so universities, think tanks, advocacy, social service organizations, they're indispensable partners. We couldn't begin to do what self-help does. And that's why 82% of MacArthur's money has gone over the 30-year history to some over 4,000 different organizations. And it was not all special project money. We believe that some money ought to go in core institutional support and large capital grants to established organizations. And I think of a MacArthur grant before my time to Human Rights Watch when I was chair that really changed the game. That moved Human Rights Watch to a whole other level of activity with millions of lives being improved or saved as a consequence. I started a version of the MacArthur Genius Awards for small and up-and-coming organizations, picking under 10, 7 to 9 organizations every year with grants up to $500,000 to do what they wanted to do. Most wanted to start an endowment campaign, to buy a building, sometimes to go to the next program level. And a few weeks ago, I toured the new offices of 2 organizations in Nigeria, CLEAN, which is a human rights group, and Action Health, which is a women's health group. And to see how relatively modest amount of money took those organizations, which were really pretty fragile, and just getting traction and enable them to take the next step and become permanent, and thus much more influential working on the problem. So these institutional awards also use the reputational assets of MacArthur effectively, just as the Genius confers. The staff hates the word Genius. The MacArthur Fellowships confer it's an enabling grant for talented people. My fifth point would be partnerships. Foundations can't do it alone.
Jonathan, you might want to say a word about what the benefits of the MacArthur Genius program is. Some people probably don't know that.
Yeah, let me come back to that.
Okay, it's fine.
In question period. The fifth point is partnerships. Foundations can't do everything alone. And to make progress on a really big problem or a key policy issue, you need help. So I was always in favor of working with other foundations. Foundations are like only children. They don't necessarily get along well with others. So getting them to work together is harder than you think. But we did some interesting things. For example, with Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller. If you live in Mellon later, we started a partnership in higher education in Africa. We worked in 10 countries, 30 or 40 institutions. And I think really put down a marker for the importance of higher education in Africa and made a big difference. We worked mainly in Nigeria. Working with government, there are always reform-minded people in government, people in small agencies sometimes that need some help. And our board anguished over giving any money. Why should we give any money to any government? But I'm in favor of it. I'll give you an example. I agreed with the Attorney General of Nigeria to fund a review of the laws of the Federation. This is maybe 6 or 7 years in, not even that, 5 years in, say, to the latest attempt at democracy in Nigeria. And the laws were loaded with artifacts from the dictatorship, military dictatorship period. And he wanted a kind of independent look at those laws, which were inconsistent with the Constitution. And so we did that, and it paid huge dividends. Most of those laws by now have been repealed, something he couldn't have done on his own. We worked in higher education in Russia in partnership with the Russian Ministry of Education, working on bringing competitive grant-making to Russian universities, but very importantly, ending, in effect, the division between research, which was in research institutes, and universities, which did the teaching, and really pioneered the concept of a research university. And we did that with Russia. Russia's got lots of money. Why does it need MacArthur money? But it needed the push from the outside, needed the reputation, needed the connections to the international community, which we could bring. And then the private sector. Ed and I think, met around an organization called the National Community Development Initiative, which he renamed Living Cities. And this was a blend of banks and foundations working in 23 cities. Ed thinks it should have been fewer, and he's probably right. But it was a good example of how foundations and the private sector could work, in this case, taking lessons learned on how you work on a whole series of issues at once in the inner city that have to happen if you're really going to get major cities healthy again across the board. So partnerships. Then I would say research. A lot of talk these days about advocacy. I believe advocacy is a good thing for foundations to do. But foundations also have a big role to play in research, and I think some of the highest impact work we did may well have come from research. About 25% of MacArthur's funds go into research. Some is quite specific. We created, in effect, or helped to create a new field called climate adaptation. A lot of people resisted the notion that you would have to take measures to adapt to climate change because it looked like you were giving in to it. What are the root causes? It's waving the white flag to talk about adaptation. But here we are working on the ground very concretely to preserve certain areas. But why preserve an area where the animals and plants are going to be somewhere else? And so we really needed to know what the best climate science could tell us about what climate change, temperature warming, rainfall variation, and so forth would mean to where rare species would be found, and then to adapt our zones of preservation to take effect of what we do. And so a whole new field got started, but with immediate practical application of our grant making. We noticed that there were fewer and fewer really first-rate university research scientists involved in public policy in the arms control area. No surprise, the Manhattan generation and its immediate offsprings were retiring and dying out, and we really needed to give a push to universities to bring along a new generation of academics who would care about bringing science to bear on critical questions of disarmament. So we started a science, security, and technology program, which I think has in fact created a new generation. We took a subset of that idea and applied it to Asia security, and have a whole new Asia security initiative where we're building not people in the U.S. to study Asia, but building centers of excellence in Asia and cross-cutting among Asia to get a conversation going among academics about critical issues of security in Asia. Housing, a big field of ours, kind of a neglected field, in my view. We sponsored a whole research network underway trying to test the proposition that housing is a critical path to community and individual development and renewal. A lot of money put into education, a lot of money put into health. But in the end of the day, I think we could show that money invested in education and health and jobs is not going to get the full impact if people are poorly housed. Either don't have decent, stable housing, or they're paying too large a percentage of their income for their housing. And we pushed a lot on preservation. Juvenile justice did work on really the issue of the developmental process. When is a young person, on average, able to comprehend the consequences of his or her actions? And the research that we did there got cited in the Roper v. Simmons Supreme Court case that outlawed the death penalty for juveniles. Very clear connection between research and a big policy outcome. A lot of the domestic work is now being aggregated into something called power measuring social benefits, which is a fancy name for a simple proposition. We need a paradigm shift in the country, I think, and I think Obama's in a good position to do it, which reminds us that the interests of individuals in trouble or need is not at odds with the interests of those of us who are more fortunate. So often we think of social programs as somehow taxing or burdening us to help people who maybe are responsible for their own problems. And what we set out to do was to show that wise public investment pay dividends not just for the people being helped, but for the rest of us as well. And this was built on the work of really a marvelous man, Ned Ramlick, who did a study in Michigan of a preschool program at Perry School. And for 40 years, he followed clusters of kids in that school who had federal access to a federal preschool program, and then kids comparable but no preschool program, and found that they did college, higher rate, they had better jobs, they paid more taxes, they committed fewer crimes. And at the end of the day, the return on the public dollar invested was $16, either higher taxes paid or cost, welfare avoided, or whatever. This is inflation-adjusted terms. And so we took that model and we've been applying it to juvenile justice, to housing, to the other fields we're in order to get a body of evidence that, well, I hope, help the country come to a different view of why we make public investments and who benefits. Because the truth is we all benefit. So research is important. Leadership, I had the view that MacArthur should be a leader in every field it was in. decision principle for a field we would put more into versus a field we would pull out of. Housing, I think we certainly took a leadership role and focused the attention on affordable rental housing preservation at a time when the country was drunk with home ownership, and we know what the consequences of that were, painfully to all of us. But we made rental housing preservation a key goal. Digital media, foundations have tried for years to improve public education, I would argue, including MacArthur, not with much success. So we wanted to stay in education, but how to do it in a way that we could add some value, and we thought understanding how the modern world, the digital world, technology was affecting the way kids learned was a good way for us to make a contribution. And indeed, I think we've created a whole new field. Human rights and international justice, big, complicated field. We're a small player, but we were, along with George Soros, I would say, the major player in supporting new institutions like the International Criminal Court, local, regional courts in Africa and Latin America, nascent commissions in Asia. Again, big, tough problem, small amount of money against it. Ed is probably saying he's out of his mind to claim anything there. We made a difference, though, and but more than that, MacArthur was the leading foundation in the field, and that met my test everywhere we went, at least trying to be weighty enough and put enough into it that we were players. Eighth point, well, there are only 9, a culture of learning across disciplines or across fields. One of the arguments for being a big foundation that works all over the world in so many different fields is that there is some learning that takes place from field to field. I'll give you a concrete example. We worked in Chicago is transforming, tearing down all of its high-rise public housing and putting in mixed income communities, a good thing. But what about the people living in these high-rises? What happens to them? It's not all about building pretty buildings. It's about improving human lives. And so we took an interest in the plight of those who were forced to leave and worked with the city to be sure that there was a fair deal for those who had been displaced. That Chicago example then clicked in my mind and said, wait a minute, we're also supporting governments all over the world to declare large tracts of land national parks where there should be no hunting, fishing, farming, housing. What about the people living there? And so we then took on a whole new field called Advancing Conservation and Social Context, in which we took on the issue of what are the rights of people living in places of high biodiversity who might have to move. Who takes care of them? What rights do they have? Are there instances where they ought to be able to stay where they are? So here's an example of something very local, public housing relocation in Chicago, and something very global, from Africa to Asia, South America, protecting people in the way of national parks, cross-fertilized. Juvenile justice, we do that only in the U.S., but it turns out places where we are deeply engaged, China, Nigeria, and Russia, appetite, fierce appetite to reform their juvenile justice systems. They may not do very well with adults, but on juvenile justice they were prepared to undertake some reform, and we had the research and also on the ground demonstrations in several states, and so we then began to take our juvenile justice work from the U.S. and to move it around the world. Other examples that I can get into in the question period. Final point, MacArthur has a sense of place, and a lot of foundations don't, especially the big ones in New York. And I think we're a much better foundation than everything we did all over the world because we were deeply engaged in our hometown. We were not embarrassed about saying part of us is, we're basically a global institution, but part of us is intensely local. And I think we did better work everywhere because we understood how really tough it is to make change. It's easy enough sitting in an office in Rockefeller Center to be willing at the end of poverty in Nigeria. But when you've worked on the ground in Chicago and the communities block by block, you know how tough it is. And I think we did better around the world in our global programs because we were knowledgeable about Chicago. And I think we were more sensitive dealing with grantees because we had to live with people in Chicago in a way you don't if you're working at a distance. Okay, lessons learned. Mention just a few and then we'll open it up. Given term limits, 10 years in my case, I should have moved more quickly to disengage from the less productive work. I should have started the new ideas process earlier. I should have put more money into it. I've been at a new school for 17 years with an open-ended contract, so I didn't fully appreciate that the clock was ticking and that the clock might run out as it did at a time when I think I was really gaining momentum in a lot of areas. My own fault. I should have started earlier. I could have. If I'd had 2 or 3 more years, it would have been the right sequence. Not that the term should have been extended. I should have got going earlier. Second point, I also should have moved faster on geographic realignment. It takes time, especially if you have obligations which you want to honor, to move the geographic focus. I moved Chicago more into Asia, China in particular, and into Africa, but I didn't do it fast enough for when money was flowing freely. I should have done more in those parts of the world. Third, notwithstanding my belief in the virtues of program and geographic scope, I, in retrospect, should have reduced the scope of work, program elements by, I would say, another 25% to get the minimum threshold of any of the major areas up to at least 20 million. I maybe rationalized that the endowments were going to rise forever and that the 20 million mark would be reached naturally. But in retrospect, still think MacArthur, for all I did, is still a little too broadly stretched. Next point, I would have given more attention within MacArthur to nurturing a culture where failure and disappointments could be discussed openly, both at the individual grant level, but more importantly at the program levels. It's not so hard to make good grants. It's much harder to string good grants together as a cluster to make a difference in a program. And there is, of course, tension between, on one hand, pushing people to set specific goals, to do annual reviews on progress towards goals, and also saying, and by the way, also let's talk about failure. And I didn't get that right. It isn't that we didn't talk about disappointments, but I didn't do enough of it. Final point. When I started, the foundation was scattered with everybody acting like an independent contractor. I created review procedures and structures that I think improved our work. For example, requiring every program element to have a work plan that laid out goals, strategies, metrics for evaluation. And I don't think there's any question the work got better. But foundations, unlike universities, are too responsive to the style of the leader. Nobody would accuse a university faculty of and I should have realized earlier that I probably wound the clock too tightly, and I needed to give more latitude to program officers to follow their passions, even if that took them out of program. I began to do that in my last 18 months, and I would have done even more if I stayed longer. So I think I recognized this, but too late to do much about it. But with all that said, I feel very good about my tenure. And my final point, which I'll truncate here because time is wasting on us, is that the foundation needs to have core values, and a foundation president needs to articulate those core values. And by values, I don't mean a rigid ideology. I think one value is openness. But I think it's important that foundations like people and other institutions need to stand for something. say, well, MacArthur is, this is MacArthur. It may not be like everybody else, but this is its character. So some of the characteristics, I think, that describe MacArthur, we take the long view, try to get the questions right through research and analysis. We believe in vigorous debate, joined by diverse voices and perspective, informed by good evidence is essential to the democratic process. We understand that governments, markets, civil society all play a role in going after humankind's best hopes, and therefore we should be for partnerships. We should support institutions and creative individuals. We understand that progress is uneven and that it takes time, and you can't, not every problem that you work on with the best of will and intelligence can be solved overnight. It takes time for a place like Nigeria or Russia to make their democratic transitions. And I am sad when I see foundations after 10 years giving up in Russia. MacArthur so far hasn't, and I think it's because we do take the long view, and I think we've grown up in realizing that progress is incremental. It's a net proposition. It's not, everything doesn't get better all at once. Some things get better, some things get worse. Some things you think you fix and then they break. But that's a value that I think that MacArthur believes in. And I guess the bottom line is that MacArthur is an optimistic organization. It believes that humankind has choices, that nothing's inevitable, that what we do matters and can make a difference. And in the end, I'm comfortable that we reach a consensus about that, and happy to take your questions, comments.
I think it would, you might want to elaborate a little bit. Don't forget the question about what the Genius Awards are meant to. But as I think about what you've done, if I'm correct, you had a lot to do, the MacArthur Foundation had a lot to do with the transformation of the education system in the city of Chicago, in supporting school reform there, and supporting the research that was done on it. And of course, the superintendent of that school, of that district, is now the Secretary of Education in the United States. And I think that the work that he did in Chicago over the years that made his reputation was greatly facilitated by the role of the MacArthur Foundation. I think it's also the case that if you think about what MacArthur did with respect to public housing in Chicago, and you talked a little bit about that, getting those are really difficult problems, and typically the large foundations with national and international reach don't get involved in them in a serious way in their hometown. But you talked about the way in which getting involved really does make a difference, not only in the hometown, but also what you learn from it with respect to things overseas. So I don't know whether you want to elaborate that or not, but it strikes me that when I look around among all the national foundations that are scattered all over the country, I don't know, with the possible exception of Pew, I don't think that I can identify large foundations that are paying as much attention to problems in a single city where they have to be based as MacArthur was.
Well, we're certainly one of the few that does. I'm going to take off on that question to make a point that may partially be responsive. A lot of the good work in education happened before I got there. And Arnie Duncan was a great superintendent of schools, but a lot of the reform was trained before he got there. And we did an evaluation of our, by then, 10 years of work with Chicago schools. I think we put $40 million in. And I gave a charge to the outside evaluators, and I said, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. First question is the school system better? And if it is, by what metric? Secondly, if it's better, what were the drivers of the improvement? Why did it get better? And the third is, when you look at MacArthur's grant making and the answer to the second question, what were the drivers, is there some alignment? Was MacArthur money going into some of the factors that made the school system better, or were we out in playpen somewhere just breaking the law? What I wanted to avoid was the cause and effect trap, because nobody in his right mind would say on any of the issues I've talked about that MacArthur did it, or even was the indispensable critical force. Lapse into that language, but in the end of the day, we have to understand that we're a small player, and if we can at least establish that the goal was met or partially met, and that our grant making aligned with what independent experts think caused the improvement, then I'm happy to be. Case of public housing, one of the critical issues, I think, was that tested now 10 years on an anniversary when the tenant groups came and met with the Housing Authority and the Foundation. The tenant organizations have their criticisms, but at base are still on board with the transformation project, and we supported the Social Science Research Center at the University of Chicago to do surveys of people who've been displaced and to ask them simple questions. Are you in better housing? Are your kids in better schools? Do you think the process was done fairly? And about 60% of the people said they were in better circumstances, not 100%, but not zero. And so MacArthur brought two things to the table. One is we were a bridge between the tenant organizations and the Housing Authority of the city. And the second is we supported research along the way that was useful both to the Housing Authority, but also the tenant groups, and also got wide publicity so that nobody was going to write a story that the housing transformation was a total failure, and here are 3 stories which probably are true and dreadful, but they're not all the only stories. And so when that never happened because we had invested in research that people was widely understood.
I think it's important, for everybody to realize that foundations have moved away by and large from research. The national foundations have, and there are some foundations that still do support research. Some of them only support research. But by and large, the trend has been away. Stan Katz has written a lot about that question, about why have the foundations drifted away. So the fact that 25% of MacArthur's budget is going for research is really an outlier among the large foundations, in my experience. And that is really an important thing, not for any self-interest in universities, but the fact is that in order to persuade relevant audiences, such as government, of the success of the pilot programs that you end up doing and getting them to buy into them and maybe take them over, research is absolutely an indispensable key to that persuasion process. Not the persuasion process, but any kind of proof that you can argue that these things are really working. So I think the fact that MacArthur is in it, staying, at least has stayed in it as long as you've been there, is a very important thing about the foundation.
Yes.
Thank you for your time. American foundations are sometimes criticized for their work abroad, for promoting, or for being perceived as promoting a Western agenda, and sometimes NGOs on the ground perceive that American foundation funding to be less legitimate or at least stigmatized because of that perception of American agenda or Western agenda. Did you confront that challenge, and if so, how did you address it?
Well, it's there, and I think a couple things. One, we're very clear and took the time to describe and talk to people, both in government and in civil society, about what foundations are, making it clear that we're independent. We worked in Russia, for example, to establish a grant makers organization, both indigenous philanthropy and the few Western foundations working in Russia with the goal of trying to educate people about philanthropy. So that was a part of what we did in any of the places where we had offices in major positions. We also supported local NGOs. When I got to MacArthur, it was heavily in the human rights field, supporting groups like Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights, all good organizations, but basically Western organizations going to Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And what we ended up doing was shifting the balance, not taking away from Human Rights Watch, but putting incremental money into NGOs on the ground. So when you build a robust network of local leaders and groups, that takes the edge off the issue you're talking about.
Were even those NGOs, though, stigmatized by others in those regions because they received your funding, or was that not a challenge?
It's not. It's an issue potentially in Russia, and so far, I don't know, a year away from it. So far, it's okay. But George Soros, for example, is stigmatized. And if you take George Soros money in Russia, you're going to have a tax audit, or you're finding ability violations, and the government's going to move in on you. We didn't have that problem, in part because we were, after all, partners with her in the higher education program. And I went to the Kremlin and sat down with President Putin, his national security advisor, and I said, I want to tell you everything we're doing in Russia and why we're doing it, and you're not going to like every grant we make. Some of the groups may have some criticism, but I want you to hear it from me, and to feel with you or anybody you want to pick up the phone and call us if you got a problem. So we made efforts to, in the most difficult place we work, which is Russia, to take that head on.
You talked a little bit about how you ended up cutting back so many programmatic areas, and I was wondering if you could discuss how you managed to choose what you thought your strategic points of entry would be in those sectors, and really how you shaped that agenda, considering you had no mandate from the Mr. MacArthur in the beginning. How you chose what you were going to actually fund and what those programs would be.
Well, the first step was to know what we were doing and lay it out on a piece of paper. The board was astounded when they saw all the element, what I call an element of work would be, conservation is a big topic, but an element would be conservation in Latin America, conservation in the Aberdeen Rift. And so we got it down to that level, and that's where we came up with 70. And then when you began to look at it, some of them weren't very good, and some of them were almost just on paper. For example, we were spending $250,000 a year to bring peace and security to the Middle East.
You could have done twice as much.
So there was some, either you're going to have to do a lot more or you ought to get out of it. And so it wasn't that hard, actually, then to pick off either work that wasn't so good or work where it was just a silly amount of money against a big problem strategy. But I think also the process of helping the board understand that they need not to be micromanaging the grants, which they were at one point, but really working on the policy and on the structure of the strategy was important, and that we shouldn't move into a new field or a new element of work without a serious thought about what our plan was, but also what we could do.
Jonathan, let me push that one a little bit. Foundations are justifiably criticized for having a short attention span. 3 years and you're out, whatever it may be. Your point, one of your points, is how long a view you take and how much you are willing to stay in the game. There is also another tier of that issue. So look at it from the point of view of the CEO who comes in and has to make those kinds of choices Pat's talking about. And so it isn't a matter of moving in or out of a particular program, but MacArthur could be into a program for 10 or 15 years or whatever, or other foundations, and a new CEO shows up and does his or her own intelligence gathering and figures, nah, we can't do this one, or these two, or these three, anymore. And in retrospect and looking forward, do you see that as a real issue? When a new person comes in and not just move around deck chairs, but really do something rather cosmic, which blows up 10 or 15 years worth of work with genuine good intention.
Complicated question, and of course it's a different answer in a time of rising resources versus contracting resources. Because I'll come back to that in a minute. I guess I take the view that the foundation makes it known to a field. You should do it, thoughtfully, and should have a view about what it's trying to do and how long and how much money it will take to do it. And that's not an idiosyncratic view of somebody who happens to be president of the moment. It's something the board and the staff need to agree on and be, fully involved in. I also think that we need to understand that we bring more than money, not just reputation, but we also bring some expertise. When the board was having a retreat, I put at everybody's place a huge notebook, and I said, "What is that?" I said, "That is a listing of all the people in all the fields that MacArthur is in that could be thought of as our intellectual capital. People that we've supported, we know, advisors, all the rest." And they said, "It's huge." Yeah, I said, "It's very, very big. And that when you move out of the field, if you do quickly, you're giving up that asset, or at least you're going to underutilize it." So you realize that moral commitment to a field, intellectual commitment to it, built up a network of advisors and grantees, and you've got a reputation, you've got a lot at stake. So I would say, rather than yes or no, all or nothing, there are ways to adapt and to change within a field that take advantage of the reputation, the expertise, and all the rest. And if I were forced to cut back the architecture, yes, you'd have to make some choices. But if you're coming in, there's a lot of latitude to do what you want to do within the fields.
Okay.
And that's going to be an issue. I think my successor, comes from a government background and is a very good guy, very smart. I think is learning the field quickly and will be a great president of MacArthur. Probably has a different take on human rights than I do. And we talked about it. And he asked me about our work on police abuse, which has been one of my interests in Russia, Nigeria, and Mexico. And I said to him, I think that those are perfectly good questions. And I'm not sure that work really is going anywhere. On the other hand, the work we're doing with the International Criminal Court, with the regional courts and commissions there, I think that's very important. I think you could argue, I could make a case that we are doing some good work. Here are two or three other areas in human rights that we haven't been working that might be worth exploring. So I don't think, I'd be surprised if he rolled up that piece of work and ended it. I wouldn't be surprised if he made some changes, and I'd support that.
You talked about transforming public housing in Chicago and how you built that bridge between the housing authority and the towns. In this area, about 12 years ago, I helped write a $35 million Hope 6 grant to transform public housing in Durham. And my question to you is, how were you able to build that bridge between the housing authority and the towns?
Well, we kind of a relocation rights agreement. That was a written legal contract. That dispelled a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the suspicion. And there was a wonderful head of the housing authority, Harry Peterson, who understood that he had inherited decades of mistrust and bad administration by the housing authority. So he was very open and really grateful to have a third party come in and help with the conversation. We also gave money to tenant organizations directly. I didn't want to be perceived as kind of basically on the side of the establishment helping to co-opt the tenant organizations. I wanted to put money, and did, into tenant rights groups and to a newspaper that was highly critical of the relocation processes in the Wilmington newspaper. So part of what we did was to fund tenant groups that sometimes were much sharper criticism of the process than I would be, but theirs was a voice that should hear. Yeah.
North Carolina's aging population is going to double in a really short time. And so I'm interested in what you learned from your work in aging and your network on aging and the programs there.
Well, there are two networks. The first one, 20 years ago, that Jack Rowe chaired, came out with this book, Successful Aging, that I think helped change the way we think about the aging process. It's not a kind of period of irreversible steady decline, but could be a period of doing some good and useful things for society and for yourself. And by the way, there are probably positive health consequences by remaining active and engaged. So that was the first network. The successor network that came on just a few years ago, that Jack is also chairing, is looking at the effect of whole society aging. So we were looking at the effect of aging on an individual, but now how do things have to change as people are living longer, and not just living longer, but having longer disability-free life. So the first job there was to get the facts straight, which he did, and the reprojection of disability-free life expectancy, I guess life expectancy, disability-free, I think showed that the official U.S. projections were, off by 3 years or something. That's a pretty large number. And then he went on to look at medical research that's in the pipeline, including drugs for Alzheimer's, and then did some scenarios. Supposing this drug were approved and is effective as hoped, what would that do to longevity? I think that suggested there's just the stuff that's in the pipeline now could add another year and a half. So it's pretty dramatic. And that information was taken by this National Academies Committee on the Fiscal Future. And of course it made all the projections that the Obama administration was wrestling with worse, and therefore not all that popular in OMB. But the aging network isn't complete yet, but it will, I think, have a set of recommendations basically about how we think about retirement age. My interest was to think through how we ought to manage the sort of lifespan. When you stop to think about it, so much is concentrated on people in their 20s and 30s, completing their education, building a stable family or partnership relationship, maybe having kids, beginning to be civically engaged, critical time in people's careers, just everything pouring in on people. And then near the end of one's active career, some of us now looking at that close in, there's less pressure, less to do, and somehow you wish you could have spread things out in a different way. So they're thinking about that question.
You might want to just say a word about the use of the networks, because MacArthur's done this in a number of different fields in a way that I don't think other foundations typically done it in a pattern.
Yeah, well, the MacArthur Research Network generally goes anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and it's a pretty substantial amount of money. By now, probably $1.5 million a year. And the idea is not to give money to one location, but to say, let's get the smartest people we can all over the world, different disciplines, some academics, some people, more practitioners, and have them work over a long period of time on a challenging problem. So the aging process was one such network. The issue of advancing conservation in a social context has been another. Another one looks at socioeconomic status and health, understand the interaction between wealth, poverty, and health, a whole series of
I was interested in your binder full of people that you work with, and I wonder, in connection with what you're just talking about, those people who you rely on for advice and support in one kind of way or another, you reward by giving their organizations grants in some ways, or just by listening to them. Are those people also occasionally included in these research networks that you're talking about? And is there anything else that you can do to do more for the people in those networks? I find we have a small one for the Himalayan work the Foundation does, and I think about this kind of question: how do we respond? Because it turns out that we're more the convener of them than anybody else is some of the time. People work together in various ways, but you've really got a good collection there. And what's the best you can do for them?
Well, let me say the notebook is everybody who probably ever walked through 140 South Dearborn. I mean, it was an expansive take on our network of experts. The use of the term network that Joel and I are just talking about is really a tightly focused, a dozen people, and we will have a relationship with those people beyond the life of the network for sure. I think the question you're posing is, could we do more with this notebook? And I would say that's on my list of things I should have given more attention to. You had a question?
Well, I wanted to know if the Genius Grants had any strings attached, and if you ever thought that somebody squandered their reward there.
Certainly not Martin.
No, I know, that's a given.
Do I need to leave the room?
I would say no and yes.
But you're not going to tell us who squandered it.
No. I'm not sure I know. We did it's been the kind of article of faith in the program that we don't do or try to do a kind of cause and effect evaluation. And what we did do once was something called an enabling study, in which we had journalists basically go around and interview maybe 40 fellows, different fields, different age groups, and to try to just tell the story of how they use the money and, in their own words, what difference did it make. This wasn't, some were stronger than others, but I think the bottom line is you have to feel pretty good about how the money was used and the effect of it. Now, Martin, I mean, you tell us the first person.
Well, I always thought you made a mistake, so for me, the money was less important than the validation.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we were in the middle of lots of fights and battles, and I think having the publicity and the megaphone was very, very helpful in ways that's hard to measure. But it wasn't the money.
Yeah. That's certainly what this enabling study said. Maybe not quite as sharply as Martin just said, but certainly the enabling, the reputational, the validation function is there. But you've been a long time in the MacArthur orbit. Do you recognize the foundation from the way I described it, or am I on another
No, it's
planet?
good. I was thinking, because, I had known the foundation before you came, and Bob Gallucci was just visiting 2 weeks ago. And it's the thing that's interesting to me is how the CEO can get cut off in some ways. I mean, you got really wonderful staff.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether it's good to keep the staff when you come in as a new CEO, or whether it's important to have some transition, or just because the staff that I knew are still there and were there before you came and after you left. And most of that's good, I think. But I wondered from your perspective, I mean, not MacArthur, but there are foundations where I find the staff really feel it is their job to screen any information that gets to the CEO and perhaps the board. And the interaction I've had with some of this foundation, I'm like, if I were the CEO of this organization and you were as controlling as it appears, I would go crazy.
Yeah, well, I was often criticized for being too involved and too engaged.
So you didn't have that problem.
But I wasn't. Nobody ever would say I was cut off. I think I pretty well knew what was going on. I didn't make a lot of changes. My basic theory: you come into an organization, is you've got a huge amount to do and to learn, and that people will sort themselves out. There'll be some number, some pretty hefty percentage that won't like the new look, or was sort of thinking about moving anyway, and this was just a precipitated move. And some already there will really like, who are very good, who will be on board. And then there'll be a kind of middle group that will sort out half and half. And so you're going to get, without trying, a lot of openings. And hiring is the most important thing you do, in a way. And I don't know how, in the end, a new administration puts itself together every 4 or 8 years. All these positions that have to be filled with so much riding on them. The searches I've done, the searches we do at universities, take a lot of time, a lot of care. So you don't want, in my view, you don't want too many searches. And you're going to have a different take on what you're looking for a year into the job or 2 years into the job than you would if you said on day one, I got to get my own people. So I didn't have that view, and Bob Gallucci doesn't seem to have that view either. So I think that's uncharacteristic of MacArthur, and I think we're a better foundation for it. There's plenty of turnover.
I loved your presentation. I think that I had not heard it articulated when you were there as clearly, because you couldn't. The candor of being able to say, here are the program elements and why we could focus, I think is really an important dialogue. Maybe you guys should co-author a new book on how do you focus. It's not just foundations. It's, even in my little organization, we're trying to figure out what do we prune out at this stage sometime down the road and keep enough space for the new things that can respond. And I used to argue with you about the role of research, but I think you were probably right and I was wrong, that there, in my work, the research from industry is so corrupting, so phony, and it just is false. So I always view, truth is an adversarial game. It's not, it doesn't spring out of research. And I don't think you ever had that simple view, but I was trying to make it. But I know for us in the work we do with Congress, if we don't have data that's real, we just don't have really a fighting chance. Even with the data, sometimes that's not enough.
Right.
But without some sort of actual sizing of the problem and where did the subprime mortgage prices come from, what are the real actors, and without being able to bound the discussion with facts, you just can't have public policy debates that are even intelligent.
I think that one of the major factors over the last 20 years, 25 years, has been the creation of think tanks that have focused on areas of public policy. And foundations have been absolutely critical in creating them and funding them. But it may be a simplistic conclusion. I think that if there had been think tanks 20 years ahead of the early 1990s when Clinton tried to do health reform, they might have been able to get it going. I think the fact that you think about the number of think tanks, the amount of money that's been put into health policy reform over the last 20 years, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It's gone for some very good research, and the public really understands now, I think, or at least a good part of the public understands what the problems are. They didn't understand that. And in order to get public buy-in for programs, I mean, it's certainly controversial even still, but in order to get buy-in, how do you persuade the public in a democracy? You give them evidence, you give them data, you document the existence of the problem. You got the Kaiser Family Foundation working full-time on health financing. You've got the Commonwealth Fund working full-time on it. You've got the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation doing a lot of things in this field. You've got the Urban Institute, the Brookings. You've got a number of think tanks that are working on it. And MacArthur has been very active in supporting many of those organizations.
And I think also demonstrations, not just research, but getting involved.
And that's part of it. That's very, very good.
Certainly.
Research and demonstration.
Impact. What do you disagree with most of what I said?
Yes, you, Ed.
That's ending on a nice note.
I don't disagree with I think I'm pretty much aligned from my experience in the way you look at it. And I was particularly taken by your point about I would have moved faster. Not that I haven't, that's your assessment, and I think that's right. But I also think about a number of foundations where CEOs came in and did move faster and left a trail of blood that people shouldn't have to see on the street.
I'm obviously not.
And I know that had no reflection on MacArthur, where I think you did a fabulous piece of work. But in a certain sense, the issue of timing and speed, and how do you get it right, because you probably, like in many jobs or professions, your first couple of years are going to set the table for the rest. So how do you get the tone right and everything else? And we know there are folks in our business now who have, a few of them, many of them have been ruthless in throwing people overboard and have not done our world very much good. So I don't disagree with what you say at all. I think it leads to my never-ending issue about the individualistic nature of funders and people who work in foundations, and how bloody much leeway they really do have. And so much more than if you work for IBM or 3M or anybody, and how those first couple of years need to be incredibly well set up and thought through, and how some people have done it well and some have not.
I would say where I should have hit the accelerator harder was not so much in the first 2 years, but maybe years 3, 4, and not from 0 to 100, but 20% faster pace in the middle period.
I think it's hard to generalize, though, Ed.
It is hard.
In large part because when a new person comes in, capacity to move fast really depends on the state of the foundation when they come in. And so some foundations can move seamlessly from one CEO to the other without any problem at all. And other foundations, I mean, Jonathan didn't say this, but I will say it. There was work that had to be done to strengthen the MacArthur Foundation when it came in. And so it would have been different, and it would have been easier for him to go faster, I think, if there had not been that renovation work that had to be done. But there are other foundations which have just had an absolutely seamless transition, where the foundation is in very good shape when the new guy comes in, as I think the MacArthur Foundation is right now because of the work that Jonathan did. So it's hard to generalize. It seems to me.
I agree. I think it's very hard to generalize, but it's not hard to identify the issue. So that you can be self-aware.
I think that's it. I didn't think about the issue in the way I'm now thinking about it when I should have. That's what I think. In my case, I'm a great fan of Adele Simmons, my predecessor. I think she did a really good job. And it was an embarrassment of riches, so many interesting initiatives that she started. And so in some ways it was easier to make choices among a lot of good things than it would be if it was dead in the water. There are some foundations we know of, not to be named, which are dead in the water. And the president comes in and there's just nothing going on. That was not my problem.
It's not on the point that the question that Jonathan asked, but one of the things that strikes me about the way Jonathan ran that foundation was that he was, as a matter of policy, believed that it was important to foster divergent views about how to solve problems. And in fact, one of his speeches talked about the fact that we frequently, MacArthur, he said, MacArthur will support people who disagree violently with one another about how to solve a problem. And what their take on it is. There are many foundations that once they've decided what the problem is, they decide they know the answer to the problem. And one of the things that I really think is important about the MacArthur approach is, that it is really important to understand that in most of the cases of most problems, there are different perceptions. There are different ways of interpreting. There are different ways of understanding the data. There are different ways of understanding what to do about the data. All of those kinds of things. And it's wrong for a foundation to say, we're going to do this and nothing else and ignore the people who criticize it.
I'll give you a concrete example. All the public housing work we did was premised on an untested assertion that mixed income housing was a good thing and would be beneficial for all. First of all, it would work, and then it would be beneficial for all who lived in the mixed income community. And we gave a grant to a research group, I forgot where, that was skeptical. That said, there's not much evidence for that, and we think when you really do the homework, you're going to find that mixed income housing really doesn't produce those discernible advantages that you asserted will. And I think at the end of the day, the jury is still out. But an example of where we actively went out and put money on somebody trying to prove that the hypothesis in which we were pouring $100 million was wrong.
Let's do one more question because Jonathan has to get back to New York tonight and we've got a fight to get him on. Anybody got a final, Van?
You used the phrase a couple of times in your answers about managing in times of rising resources versus about contracting resources, which is really what we're in now. And I'd be interested in what things you think foundation heads should do different in the time of contracting resources. Ed or Tom or anybody who's managed one in those situations. Well, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, my strong view is that foundations should be steady funders. And that it just wreaks havoc with fields and organizations within fields if you push a lot of money out when the endowment's going up and you take it back when the endowment's going down. And so we understood in the years in which the endowment was racing up. And that was, I was criticized for that. Grassley will be on your back. The Congress will legislate payout rather than 5% payout, and you have a grace period, so you don't have to do it every year. Catches up with you eventually. So, but we paid out under 5% for 4 years money. And I think foundations that push the money out don't use the money as wisely. And in some cases, they expanded their architecture in ways that were made it painful to contract. And we didn't push the money out so rapidly. And a lot of what we put out was in these new ideas, these special projects that were time limited, because I didn't think it was going to keep going up. And then when the market plunged, we kept our grant budget steady, and now we're ratcheting it down very gradually, spending as much, I think, as 7%, which of course isn't sustainable over time, but you don't have to bring it down to 5% at any cost overnight. So that's my basic advice to people running foundations is make goal number one being a steady funder, and keep money aside for a rainy day, and don't commit every dollar to kind of a structural architecture that would be painful to dismantle. Keep some of it in special opportunities that you pull back from if you need to.
If I can add a footnote to that, you talk about the macro level of spending. It is true that if you look at what foundations have done in response to the financial crisis, they've used this opportunity to weed out things that they should have weeded out before. Without the pressure of having to spend less, they simply go like just a steady course with respect to the things they're doing. So they don't ever really look at it again and say, well, what is it that we're doing really well that we ought to strengthen, and what are the things that we're not doing really well that we ought to get out of, in the same way that you did it when you came in. So they've taken it, some of the foundations have taken advantage of that.
Yeah, we even created an emergency fund of a few $1 million that we could use to help an organization that had a shocking loss. The ACLU lost some big chunk of its funding. We were able to rush a few $100,000 in. Didn't solve the problem, but it gave Anthony a little breathing room. So, anyway, I've enjoyed this very much. Very nice to be here.
Thank you.
Sorry I have to rush off.